Hello. 1, 2. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a huge round of applause for yourselves. Look at this, full house. Wow. It's amazing. I just had a coffee with Deborah just earlier, and she's never been to Wanaka, and she said, "Can you fucking believe this place?" And I said, "In what way? Is it pro-national, Deborah, or what are you talking about?" She said, "Well, maybe that, but the scenery." You've never been here before, have you?
No, it's my first time here, and it's utterly
shocking.
Beautiful.
An inner-city Wellingtonian, there you go. I'd like to... my name's Wallace Chapp, and I do a show on Radio New Zealand National, Sunday morning, and Backbenchers. I'd like to thank the Otago Community Trust for their support this session and for helping making this whole weekend possible. And by the way, do check your phones and make sure they're on silent, but for those of you who tweet, just keep tweeting. I had this very interesting debate last night about water quality. I see the esteemed journalist Rod Oram is front of house here. Round of applause for Rod. I might come ask you a question as well about inequality, Rod. But we had this great debate, and then I was having a bit of an epiphany, really, because I was having a nice Pinot Noir after the debate, looking as the sun splashed across the mountains, and the snow-capped mountains were gleaming in the sunlight. The lake was sparkling. I was drinking Mud House, and the Lord of the Rings soundtrack was going through my mind, you know. And I got talking to three women who'd been to the debate, and they loved it. And they said, what's tomorrow's about? And I said, it's about inequality. And they said, where? I said, what do you mean, where? They said, where? I said, well, inequality is increasing, and it's a big issue in New Zealand. She said, where? I said, well, maybe not right here. And she said, an abrogation of parental responsibility. And I go, whoa, okay. I said, well, it's not as simple as that. And she said, listen, I don't go down the pub. Well, I said, well, you've got a glass of wine in your hand. And an expensive one. And it was really that juxtaposition. Here we are, really, in Aotearoa, in God's own. And it was that moment where, really, we do live with great inequality, but here we were. Sometimes we might not see it. So they were going to come along this morning, so welcome as well. You've just been blown. I won't say your names. But the issue of inequality has become front and centre, a debate in the last few years. From the mid-80s to the mid-2000s, the gap between the rich and the rest of New Zealand widened faster than any other wealthy country. In the last 30 years, incomes for the people at the top have doubled, while those at the lowest end have barely increased. So to use that cliche, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And to use a very simple example out of the paper just, 6 days ago, last week, the ANZ boss, David Hisco, had a 14% increase in his annual income. It went up from $3.7 million to $4.1 million a year. In the same morning, the workers asked for a 2% increase. No, they got a 2% increase. They wanted a bit more. They're the people on the shop floor. Here's a company that made $1.37 billion in profit. So again, back to that cliche, old school: the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The OECD described New Zealand's situation as unprecedented in the post-war period. And famed economist Thomas Piketty says that the gap in wealth is reverting to what we last saw in the 19th century Europe. So as we were drinking that Mud House Pinot Noir overlooking Lake Wakatupu as the sun gleamed, it's also a nice reminder to realise that all is not well in God's own. And it's great that you folk are here to talk about it, and I'll bring the microphone around to ask questions. Max Rashbrook writes for newspapers and magazines in Britain and New Zealand, including The Guardian, the National Business Review and The Listener. He was the recipient of the 2011 Bruce Jesson Senior Journalism Award. He's the editor of Inequality, a New Zealand Crisis. A big round of applause for Max Rashbrook. And I'm going to ask for 5 minutes each, just to sort of give us a primer on how you see inequality. But first, Max, I want to ask you, where did you first become interested in inequality? Because you've been almost a poster boy for this issue in the country. So what piqued your interest?
Well, in a strange way, I really became interested in inequality in New Zealand when I was living overseas, when I was living in the UK. And that's when I first started reading about inequality in the worldwide sense. And in reading about it, that's when I discovered that fact that you just mentioned, that our increase in income gaps was the biggest anywhere in the developed world. And I thought, really? I thought, is this my country, the country that I grew up in? That really, really shocked me. And I think that was the start for me of going into this journey about income inequality and how it's changed New Zealand.
All right, okay, so 5 minutes, inequality in New Zealand crisis.
One of the things I wanted to say, and it's interesting, that anecdote you tell about that woman saying, inequality, well, where is it?
And welcome, by the way.
Welcome indeed. And it is often, if you're fortunate enough to be relatively affluent, it is quite easy not to see some of the real poverty that exists in New Zealand. But I've seen a bit of it, particularly through the work that I've done. Something I did in the course of researching the book that we published last year was I went and lived in a boarding house in Wellington for 3 weeks. Now, if you don't know boarding houses, they're places where you go to live when you basically have no other options. And so this place that I was in had 14 people in it. The room that I was living in was very small. It was extremely dirty. It leaked when it rained, so there were mold spores all over the walls. It had a small amount of very kind of cracked, horrible furniture. The whole place, with 14 people in it, had one functioning shower. It had no washing machine. It had no fridge or freezer, so you had to keep your food in your own room where it basically went mouldy. And for the privilege of living in this place, I was paying $150 a week. So, it wasn't, there was just the, kind of a real kind of exploitation, basically. But also, the other people who lived in this boarding house had no real connection to mainstream New Zealand life anymore. They existed, they were living right there in the heart of Wellington, but living essentially a completely parallel life to the ones that the rest of us lived. And so for me, that's a real kind of tangible thing about one part of the inequality story. Another thing I wanted to mention was I think this is, in a funny way, is a really apposite moment to be talking about inequality. I feel like we might just possibly have reached a tipping point with the debate in this country, because earlier this week, a number of you may have heard the Finance Minister, Bill English, talking about housing and the housing gap and the fact that, in his view, this is the big driver of inequality in New Zealand. Now, I personally don't think that's true, and I certainly don't think you should blame councils for the housing problems we're experiencing. But I thought it was fascinating because this was at a press conference he was giving that was not about inequality at all. It was about the government's books and the state of the public finances. And Bill English went out of his way to talk about inequality. Now, you go back 2 years, he was interviewed in The Listener about inequality, didn't even really want to talk about it, and said, well, okay, even if there is inequality, what can you do about it? Quote, in government, you just don't have the levers. You can't do anything about it, was what he was saying. So in 2 years, you've seen a huge transformation just in the way he's talking about that. And that's coming off the back of, what as a smart politician he knows is happening out there in New Zealand more generally. And that's that when you look at the polling evidence, when New Zealanders are asked, what is the biggest issue that we face as a country, more people say inequality, poverty, and imbalances of wealth than any other issue. So it's not just us, it's not just people in the audience who are concerned about this issue, it really is the whole of the country. And I think people are becoming increasingly aware of that gap, those figures you talked about. Well, it's the fact that incomes have doubled at the top while, basically stagnating at the bottom. And, I think it's important to think about the connections between those two things, and that's one thing that I really wanted to say tonight. It's fascinating. in that anecdote that you told Wallace, you said inequality, and the woman said where, and what she straight away was thinking about was poverty, wasn't she?
And down at the pub.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas you could have said inequality, well, right here, because inequality is about the gaps in income between all of us as New Zealanders, rich and poor, and the fact that those things are connected. I mean, they're connected in all sorts of pragmatic ways. You go back up to about 20 years ago, the growth of the New Zealand economy and the growth in the average hourly wage went together, which is what you'd expect, it's what you'd want, right? As the economy grows, people's pay grows at the same rate. About 20 years ago, that link was broken, and the economy has kept on growing, and the average hourly wage has kind of struggled along. It's now about $27 an hour. If it had kept pace with economic growth since the early 90s, it would be $36 an hour. And what's that about? That's about a huge shift in bargaining power. That people are still putting in the effort, but it's not going to people at the bottom anymore. That's the poverty element. Those rewards are instead going principally to people at the top, and particularly people who have capital to invest, and that's partly the Thomas Piketty argument. So the top is connected to the bottom. This is an issue for all of us. And you see that particularly in, I think one of the fundamental kind of animating ideas for New Zealand for the last 30 years has been trickle-down economics. The idea that as long as you allow people at the top the freedom to generate lots of income, that will trickle down, that will translate into income growth at the bottom. But we now know that that doesn't happen. That basic fundamental idea has been totally flawed. And so the reason why I talk about inequality and not just poverty is that I think the ideas that have shaped what we are as a country, the way we run things, are not ideas about poverty. They're ideas about inequality, actually. They're ideas that have justified a certain level of inequality. And kind of the challenge for the next 30 years is to think about, well, what new ideas do we have? What new ideas do we draw on that would create a very different picture from the last 30 years? In closing, I think of a quote that I heard recently from an American billionaire called John Paul DeJoria. He's obviously been very successful. And asked what drives the kind of the philanthropic work that he does, he said, well, I've always thought that success unshared is failure. And I think there is an argument that that is how you could describe a lot of what has happened in New Zealand in the last 30 years. There has been success, but it hasn't been shared. We are failing in a lot of senses as a country, and I think that's something that we will have to face up to.
Right, thank you very much. Max, now let's a big round of applause for Deborah Morris-Travers. And she's already displayed her geographical inequality by not coming to Wanaka. But Deborah was the Minister of Youth Affairs. She was, I think, the youngest person ever appointed to a ministerial rank. Is that right?
Yes.
And that was under New Zealand First?
Yes.
And then you rejected Winston, didn't you?
I did. It was that first MMP Parliament, and it was a turbulent time. So, when the government fell apart, I walked away from the party and ultimately left the Parliament. Yeah, and you now work for UNICEF, so you know a lot about how inequality might affect children. So 5 minutes from you, Deborah. Great, thank you, Wallace. Well, I'd just like to open my comments by noting that today is the International Day of the Girl, and it's the day that the United Nations brings a focus onto what's happening for girls around the world. And I think that when we're talking about inequality, it's important to acknowledge that girls and women do still face significant inequality, higher levels of violence, and not even equal pay. And in fact, one economist at the London School of Economics, Alan Manning, has said that on the current rate of inefficient government policy or ineffective government policy and discrimination, it would take 150 years for women to have pay parity with men. But I really want to concentrate my comments today on what's happening for New Zealand children. And in the past 30 years, as inequality has increased in New Zealand, so has the poverty that our children are living in. In 1982, we had 14% of New Zealand children living in poverty, and then in 1994, that reached 35%. That was straight off the back of a 1991 budget that had cut welfare benefits, sold state houses, and imposed an Employment Contracts Act. we now have about 1 in 4 or 25% of New Zealand children living in poverty. And what that looks like for Kiwi kids is that they live in very cold, damp housing, which makes them very ill. The illness is chronic, and it means that they're not participating in early childhood education. It impacts on their schooling. And because of the health impacts on their education, we create this cycle of poverty that continues. Now, when we think of our babies in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we all want them to reach their full potential, to have full health, to have education, and to be able to participate in our society. In fact, it's their right to be able to do so. But inequality has meant that large groups of our children, and Māori and Pasifika children are overrepresented here, are missing out on their right to participation, to full health, and to a decent standard of living. As an ageing society, we can't sustain this. We're currently spending about $10 billion picking up the cost of poverty and maltreatment for our children. The illness is preventable. We can be getting alongside these families and supporting them better. And the UNICEF Inequality Centre, our international research centre in Italy, says that government policy has the single biggest impact on inequality and poverty. As an ageing society, right now, for every one person who retires, we have 2.5 new people entering the labour force. But in just 10 years' time, for every person who retires, we will have just 1 new person entering the labour market. So there are social justice reasons and economic reasons, but also self-interest reasons for us as a society to start to change inequality, to make sure that children and their families have what they need to meet the needs of their children. And to the issue of parents abrogating their responsibilities, I think it's important to note that all of us parent according to the resources we have available to us. It's well known that a parent's education level is a key predictor of child well-being outcomes. But all of us parent according to our own mental well-being, the support that we have, the income that we have, our ability to house our children, and how well connected we are into our communities and our society. So the vast majority of parents want to do the best for their children. Some of them just can't because of the circumstances that they are in. And rather than judge those people, it's time for us to get alongside them, make sure that they have access to continuing education, that they are literate and can read to their children, and that we start to break the cycles that are currently leaving our children unwell and unable to participate.
Deborah Morris-Travers, fantastic. Wow. Very good indeed. I'm actually just, Scott, I'm just going to adjust your microphone here so people can hear you properly. But before I get to Scott, there you go. I'm used to the stuff being backbenchers, you know, in a pub. Before I get to Scott, though, I just want to sort of, I want to, because we have such depth of knowledge in the audience here, just think about how you grew up. And I was thinking of how I grew up in Manarua. Fairly poor community, Decile 1 school, Manarua East. But I had a great upbringing. It was very, very community focused. This was in the mid-70s. It was a community, there was social cohesion, your neighbours knew each other. How have you seen society change over the last 30 or 40 years? And I might sort of come and ask you very, very shortly. So what does inequality mean to you now, in the sense that we haven't seen it maybe 30 years ago? What does inequality mean to you? Scott Gilmore is an IT entrepreneur. In 2003, he launched the I Have a Dream project in New Zealand at Decile 1 Wesley Primary School and Mount Roscoe. It's quite an extraordinary story. And he was also a finalist in the New Zealander of the Year Awards. A big round of applause for Scott. Scott, 5 minutes from you.
Actually, I'll start out, Wallace, by saying, did anybody come to that first session? We had the two McKinsey guys and Mary Quinn from Callaghan. You know, they talked about marketing, right, and the importance of that. Well, Max, you missed an opportunity here. Max has written a great book about inequality in New Zealand, and he should have it up here, and hopefully be on sale out in the bookshop.
It is.
I got down to the library a week ago, thought I'd better do some SWOT for this little session, and was fascinated, ended up going to buy it, And I think we can start to address inequality by all these Wanaka people going and buying that book, sending all the money up to this poor author who has to live in a rest home in Wellington. Sorry, not a rest home, but a boarding house. So this I Have a Dream program, it was something that I was lucky to learn about when I was living in the States. I was sitting there, well, actually, step back a bit. I'd grown up in Invercargill through the 60s and 70s, and, you know, where was inequality there? Wasn't aware of it. We had, you know, government-funded education, government-funded health. Heck, we even had an armed forces then, with airplanes, I think. So, you know, New Zealand was a wealthy country, and I certainly, looking back, realised how lucky I was to grow up in that environment. Then I met this lovely young American girl tramping up the Waimak River a few years ago, followed her back to the States, ended up there for 15 years and 4 kids and a mortgage, and started to realise that, you know, America had these greater divisions than I'd been aware of in New Zealand. And I was sitting there one morning before going to work, read about this I Have a Dream program that was just coming to Oregon, where I was living. And for some reason, that article just resonated for me. I guess I compared what I saw in the States to what I'd experienced growing up in New Zealand. And I cut out this article, and then a few years later, I moved back to New Zealand. The wife followed me, thankfully. And then sold a software company that I'd co-founded with a friend in the States. And I thought, wow, I could actually look at doing something like that now. So I called up New York and said, would you support us if we did this down in New Zealand? They said, sure. They were quite entrepreneurial as well. And so I spent about 6 months looking around Auckland, talking to the police, the universities, the schools, all the social service agencies like Project K and Mates and First Foundation, to see, actually I didn't necessarily want to bring in this American system. I thought I could do something in this field with the New Zealand program. But there was nothing quite like this I Have a Dream program, because what I'd learnt, and you know, Max's book pulls this out very well, poverty is often multi-generational and it's very multi-dimensional. And, you know, when you listen to Talkback Radio, sorry,
That's all right.
you can often
I've
hear...
changed stations.
Yeah, you can hear the finger being pointed, right? Oh, bad parenting, bad teachers, bad community. I love the phrase, when you're pointing the finger at somebody, 3 fingers are pointing back at you. What are you going to do about it? But there's no single silver cause of families living in poverty, and therefore there's no single silver bullet solution to it. And so what this I Have a Dream program does is invests for an entire generation. So we pick up kids in year 1, and we work with them right through to the end of their tertiary career. 15 years, and that's what you have to do, that long-term intervention to overcome the multifaceted, multi-generational aspects of poverty. And so we start early, work for a long time. We are inclusive. So, you know, there's great programs out there that take the really talented kids from poor communities and give them a chance, a scholarship and a mentor and so on, and those are great. Then you've got other groups like Project K, which takes the really troubled kids in high school and helps them, and that's important. I Have a Dream takes the whole class, and it's a bell curve of talent. And what they find is that 1 or 2 kids might still end up in jail, even with your help, and 1 or 2 kids might have got to university without your help. But we take that whole bell curve and move it to the right. And so every child benefits. And that, I think, appealed to the New Zealand egalitarianism attitude that we have here. And then the third element of I Have a Dream that's very important is this role we call navigator, or the kids called Ant, their coach. Ant Backhouse, who was actually just awarded the Queen's Service Medal earlier this year for his work over the last 12 years with these kids. And he has been a constant in their lives, not replacing the parents, not replacing the teachers, but supporting them and connecting the dots between every interested party in that child's growth. And so early start, long-term, high expectations, whatever it takes of a personal, consistent, caring adult. And what we've seen with our kids, and we started with 53 in Wesley Primary School in Mount Roskill, of that group, 15 of the families went to Australia over there at a time, so 38 we ended up with. 80% of those kids got to tertiary study versus 30% of our control group. So a dramatic difference in that outcome.
One question. Have you ever thought of becoming Prime Minister?
I think I should start at Minister of Education, don't you?
All you need to do is get that phrase down at the end of the day,
Yeah.
and you could be Prime Minister.
Let's go and have a beer and talk about that.
I love these sort of stories. Give it before I go to you guys and the panel. Give us an example of one person. I was reading about a person called Kinesi Samia as an example. one person who went through this course?
Look, I've got so many anecdotes, we could be here for days talking about them.
Give us one.
Okay, boy, talk about courage. Salote is this wonderful Tongan girl who, great family, very supportive family. She's very industrious, very bright girl. She, with Ant's advocacy, was encouraged to go into the science courses, to dream about being a doctor. All through high school, however, because her father, his employment situation wasn't too stable, so almost every morning during the week through high school, Salote was getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go and deliver the Herald with her dad. And so she was going to school, tired already, coming to Dreamers after school, doing her homework, and, you know, hunger, tiredness, it just wasn't good. She wanted to go to med school, we wanted to support that, but she realised if she went to med school in Auckland, she would probably be, well, she would be still living in this very deprived household. The expectation and her desire would be to help raise money, which would make attaining med school very difficult. So she took the decision, with our help, to come down to Otago. And, you know, for a Tongan child to leave the family womb like that is very, very tough. If you understand the Pacific culture, you have very strong family ties. So her courage and her parents' forbearance to let her go, just really full of admiration for that.
Where's my tissues? That's not here somewhere. I'm going to come to you, Max, very, very shortly, but in egalitarian society, what did you see growing up? How has New Zealand society changed? I'm just going to go around the front here. Rod, move your legs. Let's start with you. Is this working? How has society changed? When you were growing up, did you feel that there was inequality? What do you think?
Well, I was like Scott. I grew up in Southland where it all seemed to be, you know, all butter and cream, and probably still is. But I've worked in education, so I have seen over the years the inequality, particularly when I worked in Hawke's Bay. And a different cultural background, it came as a real shock back in those days.
What about you growing up? Did you see inequality? Do you think it's worse now?
I think it is worse now. When you look at children having to have breakfast in schools and things like that.
And how about you? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Dunedin, and I lived in a privileged society, I think, but I came to earth with a bump when I married an American and went to live in Nashville, Tennessee.
Did you?
I did.
Nashville, Tennessee.
Right.
Round of applause for this country woman. Who's your favourite country western singer?
I wasn't a country and western fan.
Okay, all right, there you go. All right, forget about it. All right. Hey, this guy here, Rod Oram, what about you? Because you're from the back blocks of Birmingham. So what does inequality mean to you? Surely Birmingham was the bastion of inequality, not Aotearoa.
No, there was real inequality. It was a grimy industrial Victorian city, and whilst I had a very middle-class upbringing, I certainly had little glimpses of that. However, there was a political system around that, the welfare state after the Second World War, which had huge benefits. So people could go to university for free, for example, could actually get paid to go to university, as indeed they could be here. So we've seen all that sort of thing break down. To me, what's really necessary is actually a fundamental economic and political revival. I'm afraid I'm not optimistic about just being able to lean on politicians to move the present system. Sorry, I'm not advocating revolution, I'm just...
Thank goodness. Thank goodness. Max, were we ever an egalitarian society?
Well, it depends how you define egalitarianism. You would have to say, I mean, if you go back to, say, the early 1980s, which is at the point where our inequalities really start to take off. Now, anyone who's lived through that time will know that that was not exactly a paradise. I mean, it wasn't egalitarian if you were a woman, say. It certainly wasn't egalitarian if you were Māori or Pacifica. So you have to kind of put those caveats in there at the start. But if that said, we did overall have some of the narrowest income gaps anywhere in the developed world. Yeah, I mean, and to give you a sort of rough rule of thumb, someone in the top sort of 10% of New Zealand back then would have earned maybe 5 times as much as someone in the bottom 10%. that gap since then has roughly, well, it kind of doubled by about sort of the early 2000s. It's now fallen back off again a bit. But so that's that sort of 5-to-1 gap. That was a very, very equal society, and that's where the countries who are still the most equal in the world, and it's the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, countries like that, that's about the level of inequality they have now.
Gosh, really, is that right? Deborah, there are twice as many children living in poverty now than there were 30 years ago. 2013, 285,000, or 27% of New Zealand children lived in poverty compared to 14% in 1982. Big increase of children living in poverty. This is your expert area. How did we get to this stage?
Yeah, essentially what has happened is that we have allowed our governments to neglect children, to ignore the rights and interests of children in policy making. And I think what is starting to happen is that we're recognising that if children are not prominent in our government's consideration, that decisions will be taken that will have unintended negative consequences on them. So I think that simply because there have not been robust processes within government to ensure a consideration of the impact of policy on children, but also because there hasn't been a public understanding of the importance of our children and the need for them to be a priority, we have effectively led our governments away with this. I think it's starting to change, and the fact that our opinion polls are showing high levels of concern about inequality and poverty, to me, is quite promising. And what I've been working to do is to continually engage people and help people recognise that we have to reinvigorate our democracy so that all of us can start to hold our governments to account and start to make it very clear that as a public, we want action on behalf of our children. They are not voters. And so what happens is that our policy process is essentially skewed towards those who are engaged in politics and who are voting. So for example, we spend 5 times as much on people who are in their last 2 years of life as we spend on children in their first 5 years of life. Now, from an investment approach, it's not that I want to be pitting young against old, I don't. But we're really good at protecting our elderly from poverty, and we do that because we have universal provision and because there has been cross-party agreement about the importance of our older people. And we need to build the same kind of consensus around the importance of our children.
Do you agree with that? Oh, wow. Do you agree with that? There seems to be a body of research. The chief science advisor, Sir Peter Gluckman, said the same thing as well. He said, the more we know about research, the more we realise that the first few years, the first 100 days of life, in fact, are as vitally important as we've ever known before. So we need to wrap around services around that and target that a lot more. What do you think?
Oh, Sir Peter Gluckman's report, the first 1,000 days, is brilliant.
1,000 days, sorry,
yep.
Yes.
The first 3 years of life is where socialisation, language development, everything happens. And when you've got a home, if there's one parent, we know that's stressful. Sometimes in a lot of our families in the Dreamers group, there's 2 parents. They're often each working 2 jobs just to put food on the table because of the poverty of wages. So, a story of when our kids went from intermediate school to high school, one of them, I'll leave the name out, she hadn't enrolled even 2 weeks into the start of the new year. And I said to Anne, what the hell's going wrong? We've held hosting sessions at the end of intermediate school for the parents to come down and meet the intermediate schools they're going to, or the high schools at least. Why hasn't this happened? And what he told me is that this girl's mum works 2 jobs, 7 till 3 and then 4 till 10. And the dad didn't have any English language skills. So when exactly could she go to school and enrol? When could she go to the parent-teacher meetings? So, there's things that we could say that's bad parenting, but no, when you look into it, there's a lot of issues against good parenting. So, yeah, there's lots of things we need to do. There's another great study here. Hart and Risley did a study in St. Louis, I think it was, back in the 60s. They measured language development in homes, 42 homes. They'd spent an hour per week over 2.5 years measuring the volume and the type of words that each child was exposed to. And what they found is that professional families spoke like 6,000 words per hour, middle-class families about 2,500, welfare families about 1,000. So by the age of 4, there was a 30 million word gap for these children. So when they turn up at primary school on day 1, guess who has the ability to read a book, hold it properly, understand what the teacher's saying, be able to interact? So, you know, this is just something that we've got to address early on in life.
This is very interesting.
Early childhood education, these are all key.
I'm going back to that sort of mud house Pinot Noir overlooking the beautiful vista and that abrogation of parental responsibility. I make light of it, but it's something that you hear time and time again, Deborah. It really is. It's to use that cliche, but people say, as I said last night, look, I was on the dole as well in Hokitika, but how hard is it to give a kid give your daughter or son a porridge every morning or Weet-Bix? It costs nothing.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that of the people who are currently on the sole parent benefit, it used to be called the domestic purposes benefit, there are 69,000 women who are parenting solo in New Zealand and 6,000 men. And what the data shows is that in recent years, there has been a 17% reduction in the spending power of the sole parent benefit. In contrast, the national superannuation benefit has had a 9% increase. So policy is actually making it almost impossible for these families to provide those really basic things to for their children. And the cost of electricity means that, you know, it's hard to keep the home warm. And the government's own data shows that when you look at parents, there are only about 5% of parents who are in really high rates of dysfunction, and, you know, to the extent that they won't be considering their child's well-being. 95% of parents in New Zealand are absolutely committed to their child's well-being, and as I say, they will do the best that they can depending on what resources they've got. If the parent has a low level of education, we need to get alongside them and provide them with a chance to improve their education, to be literate and to be talking to their children and reading to their children. So, you know, this stuff is actually solvable if all of us get engaged in this debate and, you know, require our governments and our communities too, because on things like family learning and literacy, there can be a really strong community response. And there's some magic starting to happen in some of the communities around New Zealand where, for example, schools have got school gardens. They're bringing parents in to teach them how to garden, harvest the food, preserve the food, feed their children nutritious food. But what's coming out of those kinds of projects is that other social needs are being met. Children are saying we're cold at night because we don't have enough blankets. So then people are helping to teach the children to knit. Whole communities are knitting squares and donating them so that they can make blankets for the children. So that kind of community response is really powerful.
Well, you're in a unique position to know what the children themselves are saying from the reports you've been doing. So give us an example, give us one or two examples.
Yeah, so in talking to children, they say things like, you know, they want their parents to be well supported, and they know that government and community have got a role. They really want their parents to stop being angry. You know that we've got real issues with child abuse and neglect, and it's very clear from child health data that children who are living in deprivation are 10 times as likely to be hospitalised from abuse and neglect. Of course you're going to be angry if you don't have enough money to take care of your children, if you're at the bottom end of the income scale and life is against you. They also say that they want their parents to have time to play with them. And, you know, again, it's an issue of if you're working 2 jobs, how on earth are you going to have the time, energy, or emotional availability to sit on the floor and play with your kids? And they say that hunger is a significant issue, that they want food in schools, and they really want the government to act on this.
Can I just add something? I think that's absolutely right. And one thing, well, 2 things I've seen actually, a story and a piece of data. One of the women that I interviewed for the book was a woman called Kelly, who's a single mother living in Papakura in South Auckland. And we called Kelly's story So Many Obstacles because there were just an unbelievable number of things in the way of her trying to achieve the success that she wants for herself and for her kids. Now, to tell you her whole story would take up all the time we have in the session and more, but just briefly, they included things like she and her 2 kids were living in a house where one of the water mains had burst, and so the carpet was so damp that your socks got wet just walking on it. Rather than her landlord doing anything about it, and this is a classic condition if you're renting at the bottom end of the market, she actually had to take her landlord to the tenancy tribunal and won, but the process was so unpleasant that she basically didn't want to be there anymore, so she shifted house a number of times, always trying to get a better house for her kids, but has also kept her kids in the same school because she wants them to have continuity of their education. And she's been trying to go back to work or study. So a typical day for Kelly can involve 4 hours of travel, or it used to, on the buses, trying to get the kids from where they live to the school that she wants to keep them in, and then another bus for her to go and work in like cleaning at Auckland Airport, which is what she used to do, getting paid $14.80 an hour, that whole round trip taking a couple of hours, and then the same thing going back. Then she's had discrimination from all sorts of private agencies. She had an emergency where she had to ring for an ambulance off her mobile phone. She had very poor coverage. She complained to Vodafone, and they said, well, it's your fault for not having a landline, which I don't think they say to couples who live in Remuera. She had issues trying to come off the benefit, going on to something that's called the minimum family tax credit, where IRD and wins between them basically held out on about $4,000 worth of payments she was entitled to. Yeah, and so in a situation where every dollar is accounted for, that is pretty crippling. Kelly's had multiple health breakdowns just from the sheer exhaustion of trying to manage the situation, you know, working, going. She's been studying medicine so she can get a better job, but has just been totally overwhelmed by all these barriers. And there are lots more that I don't have time to tell you about. So there are just incredible obstacles in the way of people who are trying to do the best for themselves and their kids.
And how tiring and how exhausting must that be?
Utterly. I mean, her day, you know, she got the kids, you know, her day would finish at 11, then it would start again at 4 or 5 in the morning, you know, and a couple of years ago, she had this total physical collapse where the doctor said, well, it looks like you've had a kind of chemical burn along your whole body, and that was just utter exhaustion. And that's a really deeply disturbing story. The bit of data that goes with that in terms of you think about, you know, the opportunities that are open to Kelly. And, you know, opportunities are really important, I think, for all of us. I mean, in this room, there are probably people who have very different views about equality of incomes. I mean, just actually how equal do you think people's incomes should be? But I think everybody would say that equal opportunities are really important, right? The thing, though, is that what the international data shows you very, very clearly is that the two things are absolutely linked. If you live in a very equal country like, say, Denmark or Sweden, only about 20% of your income as an adult can be predicted from what your parents earned. If you live in a very unequal country like the United States or Britain, half of your income as an adult can be predicted from what your parents earn. So there's incredibly strong transmission of advantage and indeed disadvantage from one generation to another. Now, I don't think any of us would say, yeah, I want to live in a society where basically half of my likely success as an adult is pretty much predetermined, you know, and yes, in those societies like America and the UK, you do still get people who make it up from the bottom, but they're a very, very small number. And what those countries are basically saying is, we're going to make it incredibly hard, just like it's hard for Kelly, but we're going to keep on going because, hey, there are some exceptions. Yeah, there are some people who make it up for the bottom. But a guy that Wallace has worked very closely with, Damien Christie, in the book, he wrote a piece for me and he said, yes, there are exceptions, but you can't build a country on exceptions.
Very, very good indeed. Scott, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, the story about Kelly in Max's book was very powerful, resonated for me, and it reminded me of a great study that Auckland City Mission just published earlier this year, and it's on their website. I urge you to go and look at it. But they actually mapped out the number of service agencies and government agencies that these families in poverty have to work with, and that's what it looks like. 27 agencies, your typical single mother or poor family or struggling child, they have to liaise with government, non-profits, and so on. And think of how difficult that is just in terms of time, in terms of transport. And if you haven't got a car, or there's only one car in the family and that's taking the dad to work, then you've got to get on the bus at further cost. And if you've got English as a second language, that we actually, although I guess the good news is the agencies are out there able to help, maybe with a budget, but the bad news is it's not coordinated, it's not integrated. So this is the problem. There's no easy way for these families in poverty to really climb out of that, on that ladder, because a lot of the rungs on the ladder are broken, I'm afraid.
Yeah. What about, the annual household income report, a 245 report came out very recently, Max, that inequality is not growing, that there's a 4% gain above inflation between 2011 and 2013. So, yes, over time there's been inequality, but it's in the last 15 years we're not seeing it to the same extent. What would you say to that?
I think that's true to an extent, but it's not the whole picture. If you're talking about how income gaps have grown in New Zealand over the last 30 years, you have the huge increase through the 80s and through the 90s, and that continues right through until about the early 2000s. And what happens then is you get a few things, in particular working for families, which basically start to redistribute some more income to those low and middle income families. And so what that does is that holds our level of inequality about steady. So we've never gone back to the level of equality that we had in the early 80s, but some specific government interventions held it pretty steady through the late 2000s. Then what has happened with the global financial crisis is the recorded measures have kind of been jagging all over the place, because what happens typically in a big crisis is obviously life is really tough for people at the bottom. People lose their jobs, people don't get pay rises. But people at the top also take a temporary hit to their incomes because the share market isn't doing so well. Those kinds of returns are lower. And so I think that is artificially depressing our measure of inequality. And what I think you will see in the next couple of years, particularly with things, because working for families is actually being eroded, it's not keeping pace with inflation. What I think you will see in the coming years is that gap between the rich and poor will start to tick up again as people's incomes at the top recover post-crisis.
Deborah, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that it is likely that we'll see the gap start to increase again as the economy recovers from the recession, because as Max says, those top incomes will increase, and currently not enough is being done to make sure that the incomes at the bottom increase as well. So the gap will increase in the next few years.
Yeah, we haven't fundamentally changed the structuring, and I sort of keep making this point. What has happened in New Zealand, the reason we've had these big increase in income gaps is not, the evidence is not that it's because people don't work as hard or because people are making the wrong choices or something. It's about the big structural things that have changed about who gets the returns from work, what are tax levels like, what are benefit levels like.
So what should tax levels be like? Back to the bad old days when I was 60, 70%?
Well, there's a whole lot of options. People might be aware of this book by Thomas Piketty called Capital in the 21st Century, which is kind of overturning economics and economic thought at the moment. His big point is that you can talk about income a whole lot, but actually wealth, the accumulated assets that people have are also incredibly important. And his solution is there should be an annual wealth tax right around the world, levied on all the wealth that people hold, and that it would increase with the level of people's wealth. So
explain that for us.
Well, his example, if you had, say, a fortune of over, let's say, $1 million, then you might pay a levy equal 1% of that every year. If you had over $100 million, then you would pay a levy equal the value of 2% of that. If you had over $1 billion, 10%, and so on and so forth. And so what that would do is it would significantly reduce wealth disparities, and because you generate income out of the wealth that you hold, that would reduce income inequality as
The
well.
wealth tax. Rod Oram, what do you reckon about that? It sounds a bit bizarre to me.
No, it actually loops back to the earlier session we had today, because the nature of the global economy is changing so markedly, and that's why wealth is aggregating far faster than it did. So there's a lot of sense in trying to do that, because it's the people who are living on earned income which are really struggling. So there is a lot of sense to that. It's a fundamentally difficult thing to do.
Why?
Well, just to get compliance would be.
Yeah.
It's the simple thing. It's jolly easy to tax people's income at source. It's a lot harder to tax people's wealth as it's stashed away. But the wealth effect is incredibly important. So imagine a family struggling in Auckland on $50,000 a year. If they can't save for a house, but if there's some wealth in the family to get a down payment for a house, then that's a must use that word, fundamental. That's a very, very different kind of life for that family on $50,000 or $60,000 a year as they build up their own equity than it is for somebody who's trapped renting.
All right, well, let's speak to a Wanaka millionaire. How are you, sir?
I'm very healthy.
You're a millionaire?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, this is right. You're all millionaires here.
Everybody who lives here is a millionaire.
Well, a millionaire in spirit as well.
Well, anyone with a house is a millionaire.
Round of applause for this gentleman. I think I kind of agree with you, actually, right now. So what do you think of wealth tax? What would you say?
It's a great idea, but it's very hard to actually administer, because if you are not dependent on income, you're a very hard person to tax. Humans are like little weasels, and if you've got your nuts squirreled away somewhere...
All right, that's enough. That's enough. Stupid metaphor. What about you? You're a younger Wanaka millionaire.
Not quite.
What do you do?
I work in real estate, and
Right, so you got 2 waterfront houses.
not quite. No, actually, I'm a middle-class New Zealander. Come from a great family, originally Auckland. And
What are you hearing? What do you think about this morning?
well, I'm in crossfires because I've actually raising a young family in Wanaka, and it's actually blooming tough. You know, to make the money just to survive is quite hard. So I mean, I'm privileged to be here for a start. Second thing is I've lived all over New Zealand, and certainly, I feel sorry for the kids in 20 years' time. With the housing that's going up, and who's going to buy these houses in 20 years' time? Because
who agrees with this gentleman here?
Yeah.
Who agrees? Hands up. What do you think?
I think there should be a wealth tax, yeah, definitely.
All right. One thing, speaking to inequality, I had this, Deborah, I had this quite a sobering conversation 2 nights ago with a guy, maybe 30. I said, how are you going? Talking about, met him at the pub. You know, he was working hard. He just come working at Victorina. I said, you saving for a house? He goes, no. He goes, why not? It'll never happen. And for some reason, I kind of broke down a bit. I just thought, it'll never happen? He goes, no, it's not going to happen. And I thought to myself, is that inequality? What future has he got that he's 30, he'll never be able to... He doesn't even dream about it anymore.
Yeah,
I couldn't believe it.
I started university in 1991, and it was the year that student loans were introduced. So, you know, I was the first kind of cohort of young people who had a student loan. It just so happened that I got myself a good job at Parliament and I could pay it off. But the burden of student loan debt for people is one of the things that, of course, makes it difficult for them to own homes. But, you know, our government, successive governments, both National and Labour, are culpable in this situation. There hasn't been, good regulation of the housing market and decent policy around this. And the result of it will be that, you know, we will have generations of younger people who don't own their own homes and therefore don't have the same kind of stake in their communities. And what we're starting to see for children is that the transience that some of them are experiencing is really taking its toll on them.
I think this person really hit it on the head.
Yeah.
This children in 20 years' time and this young guy here is concerned about the future. So am I.
Yeah, and I think we ought to be, because, you know, we need children and young people who feel like their society cares about them, so that in turn they will care about their society, and that they can have some stability and security and be able to, you know, contribute. So I think that housing has to be a priority focus.
Scott, what do you think?
Back to my original point, there's so many factors at work here. You know, housing's vital, health is vital, nutrition is vital. Education, I think, and this came out in the earlier panel discussion, we can address a lot of this with education if we invest properly, longitudinally, but making sure the child, you know, Kelly's story in Max's book is instructive, because she decided to keep her children at this one school and she travelled to the work and the study and the home. That's not always available. A lot of our children in the streamers program, and I see in the schools, the low decile schools, when you have family breakdown, in fact, it's funny because Pacifica and Maori culture, very strong family ties, right? So if you can't look after your children, you send them down the line to auntie or grandma, and that's good in a way, but what it means is there's tremendous levels of transience. They're switching schools every 3, 6, 9 months. Guess what? Who's that guy? John Hattie. You know, he's done this metadata on educational outcomes. The single biggest determinant of a child's educational success is the relationship with their teacher and that teacher quality.
Is that right?
Yeah. And if you're changing teachers every few months or every year, there's no relationship. So, you know, we've got to redo, and so it comes back to housing. So there's so many touch points.
I can relate, and this is where inequality is, and Max, you agree, it's a complex issue, yeah? So there's many things that feed into it, and I can relate a little bit. Growing up in Manarewa in South Auckland, Dad's from Fiji. Okay, I don't look it. Married a Pākehā from Takapuna. But he said he grew up in a village. One thing that was unique about his growing up, there were no books in the family. And in fact, he said there was one book. It was the Bible. And he said when he came to New Zealand, the one thing he'd do when he had children was to wrap them up in books. And in fact, one of our, in a 3-bedroom house, he made one of those rooms into a library. He was in love with books. And I can remember reading and sitting on rainy days, trying to read Jean-Paul Sartre to page 2. Could never get past page 2 and being in nothingness. But I tried. And Dad would say, how's it going, Wallace? I go, can't make head nor tail, Dad. So keep going. And that was Manarewa. And I learned early on the magic of reading, the magic of literacy, and I saw Dad trying to sort of get to his Pacific parishioners the importance of literacy. Deborah.
Yeah, there's a great example in Auckland of Comet, a council-owned company that is working to bring whole families into the school environment, and it's a really great model because the parents are getting literacy education and the preschoolers are coming into the school to get their early childhood education. And by creating a culture of education within the home, we start to really tackle some of these issues. And that's why I think it's a crying shame that the government has removed the training incentive allowance, but also community education, because it's one of the greatest things that we can do is to allow people the opportunity for lifelong learning and encourage parents, because at the time that a couple discover that they're pregnant, and then when that baby is born, those are very important moments for intervention. If the environment's not ideal for the new baby that's coming, it's a time to get alongside them and help them start to improve the environment that the baby will come into. And you know, those parents are ready to learn at those times, so we have to provide opportunities for parenting education so that the style of parenting is positive and enables the optimal development of the baby. And that those parents have got all of the health information and knowledge that they will need to be successful in their parenting, including being literate.
Yeah. I'm going to throw it open to you, some questions from you wonderful folk in the audience there. A couple of solutions. Max, what would it take to lift... Well, no, actually, I want to ask this first. What's the difference between relative poverty and abject poverty? Because some would say, as you might hear on Talkback Radio, I know poverty, I've been to Calcutta. and I've seen real poverty in the slums. Don't you tell me that we have abject poverty in New Zealand. We have hardship, or as Bill English summed it up, particular financial circumstances. What are you laughing for? But we don't have real poverty. What would you say to that?
Well, someone who has been to Calcutta is one of the guys who contributed to the book I edited, Professor Jonathan Boston. And he will say, and he has said publicly and got some stick for it, that actually there are some overlaps. That some of the children who he sees growing up in very poor New Zealand households live in circumstances that are similar to some of perhaps the better off children in the slums of Calcutta. So he's been there and he's seen it, and that's his opinion. And so that gives you your first half of the question. There is some absolute poverty in New Zealand. I mean, in kids who are growing up in, the conditions that are a bit like the boarding house that I lived in, and, some of the families that you guys see in your work, places where, you're living in really substandard housing that is cold, damp, mouldy, where there just isn't furniture around, where there's all sorts of things that aren't working, where there is fundamental abject poverty, and there's a certain number of New Zealand children who are in those environments. Then on top of that, you have the relative poverty, which is saying poverty is not just about not having basic things, it's also about not having the things that society has decided that you need in order to be able to participate. So Adam Smith said this, centuries ago. Poverty is about not having the things that society has deemed it, that credible people cannot be without. And that changes all the time. So in his day, this sounds incredibly archaic, but it was having a linen shirt. You couldn't be a credible person in society unless you had a linen shirt.
So what's the modern example of that? Is it a flat screen TV? An iPhone 6? Who said that? You.
Internet.
Yeah, internet.
Internet.
I think Deborah's absolutely right. Yeah. That is something that, 30 years ago didn't even exist. 10 years ago might have been seen as a luxury. Now, with the increasing focus that schools are putting on, online learning, it is very, very difficult now to be able to get by without an internet connection and some kind of device that allows you to access that. And more fundamentally, that poverty, and when Deborah says, 1 in 4 New Zealand kids is in poverty, that is all the kids who are in families who've basically got less than 2/3 of the average income. And it's about that point, so if you're a single person that's, having less than $20,000 a year, for example, people below that line, you may be able to get by in an absolute sense, but you cannot actually participate in society. You can't go out, you can't have people around, you can't actually build friend networks, you can't take advantage of the opportunities, you can't upskill, you can't afford to go into education. And it's that poverty, not having that level that society has deemed adequate, that's the relative poverty, and that's a very important part of the story alongside the absolute poverty.
Hey, who's got a question? Who's got a question for this wonderful, wonderful audience? There's a few questions around here. Let's go right over to here, and Deborah can speak to something. I think there's a report coming out, actually, that Deborah might be able to give us a sneak preview on very, very shortly. Who had the question over here? It was you. All right, what's your question?
What about the greatest stumbling block would be alcohol and drugs?
A good stumbling block would be alcohol and drugs. Deborah.
Yeah, there are issues like mental illness and addictions that absolutely do need to be addressed. Again, those are things that community and government can help to improve if they get alongside people. There are issues for some parents, but not for all. And I think, we do live in a culture, where alcohol is marketed at us, quite significantly, and it seems to be a part and parcel of the New Zealand way. So I think for parents who are under pressure, that there will be times that they will, just like the rest of us, enjoy a drink. There'll be a very few parents who would buy alcohol in place of food for their children. It's a very limited number.
Have you got a small response to that? Do you want to have a response to that? What do you see? What do you think?
Well, I try and believe you.
Yeah. And
Or, you want to believe, but what you see is otherwise?
I live in a lower socioeconomic town on the west coast, and I see probably a bit more than what you say.
Yeah, and I think, there probably will be pockets where it's, that is more evident, where, perhaps parents are making poor choices. I have seen some research that shows that for parents who are under high levels of socio-economic pressure, that sometimes their choice making won't be as good as it could be. But I think it's also clear that people with less money are not necessarily, any worse at managing their money than you or I are, but it's just that we've got more money to play with and a bit more room to move, and so even if we make bad choices, it's not going to have the same kind of effect.
I've got to bring that up.
Yeah.
The poor choices thing is something that will come up, and it's got to be addressed. So, Scott, what do you think?
I guess the response here, and something I've learned, one of our trustees in our program is Constable Nick Tuatazi, who is well recognised in the Mount Roskill community for a lot of fantastic community development programs. And what he taught me is this concept of a four-legged stool of youth support. And the four legs are first family, secondly culture and community, thirdly education and employment, and fourthly the peers, the friend group. Now, if those four legs are all in place, that child will grow up very stable, very well-rounded, very successful. And I'm sure all of the children of the people in this room are probably representative of that. But if you take away any of those legs, and often the first one to go is family, if you have a bit of family breakup or dysfunction or unemployment, the stress comes in and that leg gets a bit wobbly. Often, and I'm talking here mainly about Pacifica and Maori community, that community and culture is often at odds with what they're seeing on TV and in school. And so that leg gets a bit shaky. Then education starts to get shaky as well. And if you haven't got an education, you haven't got employment. So what happens? They fall back on that fourth leg, which is their peer group. And guess what? This is where the gang steps in. And the gang provides family, employment, and culture. So no wonder the gangs...
Have you seen this?
I'll tell you the name of the gang in our Mount Roskill community. It's a fairly blatant marketing message to young males. It's DMS, drugs, money, sex. Now, I'm sure any of us, any of our children would not look at that as a rational choice. But if, as I described, you take away those four legs, the DMS actually becomes a semi-attractive option. So It's not bad choices, it's desperation.
All right. Now, is there any questions over here? There's one right in the... Oh, there's one right here. Maybe you can stand up and shout it.
I'll shout it out.
Stand up so we can see you.
Scott, you said that you changed the bell curve from a 30% to a control group to an 80% matriculation to university. Do you think you could scale it, or what's needed to potentially scale it?
Great straight man. Thank you, John. It's a really good question, and I guess it's a way of starting to sum up some of our discussions here. We might look to the government to do a lot more, and I think that's reasonable, but unfortunately the government's on a 3-year electoral cycle, right? And as we've discussed, these poverty issues are multi-generational. So we've got to think longer term, and that requires a cross-party agreement, and good luck getting in that in this current government. So I think there is a role for the private sector to step up here and for the non-profit world. So it's interesting. Who's heard of Richie Poulton, the great guy in Dunedin that runs a longitudinal study? I saw him at a TEDx speech in Dunedin a couple of years ago. He's fascinating because his data of 40 years of these families, 1,000 kids in Dunedin, he can, nature versus nurture, he's answered that. I went up and actually had a meeting with him the next day, showed him our data, because we've had an educational researcher track us, because I wanted to say to people, this works. And after 12 years, we know it works. Trouble is, he said, you've only got 53 kids. So the sample size is too small for anybody in Treasury to accept this as an argument. So, and here's my marketing message, we are scaling up. Thank you, John. We've been talking to 2 communities, one out in West Auckland, one up north of Whangarei, and we're going to roll this program out, subject to fundraising, to an entire school community. So the one we're looking at in Whangarei, for example, is 3 primary schools feeding into 1 high school, about 1,500 kids. We're going to take our model of putting a navigator on year 1 who will work with those kids right through to year 15, being the dot joiner of every social sector agency, every issue that family's confronting with that will keep that child from succeeding in school, and will overcome those issues. So if we can do this over the next 10 to 15 years for 1,500 kids, our costs will be about $1,000 per child per year. So it's a minuscule increase on what the government already spends on education. So, you know, if you want to support us, go to our website, www.ihaveadream.org.nz. We've got a give a little button there. We desperately need support to make this happen. If you want to sign up to...
Well, they're all millionaires.
Support a child.
They can, very easy. Very easy. Free houses on the waterfront.
I've got business cards, I'll hand
all right. If there was a country, Max, that we could turn to and say, they're doing it better than us in 2014, what country would that be?
Well, it's probably the ones I mentioned earlier, and it's countries like Denmark, Finland, Sweden, those kinds of countries. And the bad news is there isn't any single thing, one thing that they do that means that they have smaller income gaps than we do. But
I heard, and maybe you can correct me, but Denmark, for example, had a culture of egalitarianism that perhaps we don't. Now, there's a quote from the Spirit Level authors, that well-known book, quoting here, and I'm surprised by this, but anyway, quoting, Americans have a higher tolerance or even a liking for inequality. They see it as an opportunity to get rich. New Zealand is pretty high on that list too.
Yeah.
And Denmark doesn't have that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's true to a large extent. One of the other things that countries like Denmark do is they take a more kind of grown-up view to how do you manage society and how do you manage the economy. And so they have systems where basically you have the government and you have business and you have workers in the form of unions sitting down together, meeting regularly at a high level and thrashing things out. And they have the kind of level of trust where all three of those groups will accept things that might be difficult in the short term for a long-term gain. So that trade unions there don't spend a whole lot of time trying to fight restructuring if technology is making a whole bunch of people unemployed and unemployable. They say, okay, fine, this will happen, we accept it, but government and business, we're looking to you to invest a whole heap in skills training so that these people can find work in the new kinds of jobs that are available.
Education.
Yeah, education. And those countries, I mean, there's a lot of things they do that we couldn't necessarily import, but they really take training seriously, lifelong training. There are so many more opportunities.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
They really take training seriously.
And they invest in it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the report that's imminent. In a couple of weeks' time, UNICEF internationally will release a report on the children of the recession. And it'll look at what's happened in terms of the levels of poverty for children across the OECD, but also the numbers of young people who are not in education, employment or training. And that's a real issue for our young people in New Zealand because, you know, we can no longer take for granted the kind of productive young adulthoods that our parents and our grandparents enjoyed. And having a period of time not in education or employment or training in those, you know, years between sort of 15 and 25 really sets our young people behind for things like home ownership and things in the future. So we looked at the Netherlands a few years ago as an example of a society where although they only spend slightly more on their children than we do, they invest very heavily in the early years. They have a culture of respect for their children that's different from New Zealand. And so one of the things I do think we need to be building New Zealand is an understanding that our children are citizens now, that they have got rights that we have to be meeting, and that those rights are around protection, they're around provision, and they're around participation. And that when we get it right for our children and young people, we will all do a whole lot better. So, you know, that is the work that I'm involved in with UNICEF and a whole lot of other people in communities around the country, and it's work that really, you know, needs the support of people like you too.
Now, Scott, I just want to ask one more question because we've only got 4 minutes to go. One burning question. There's one over here. If you can bring the microphone to this person here with the blue, in the blue, and that can be our summing question.
You talk a lot about helping children, but income is also, I think, perhaps the first starting point for many of these families. are there going to be enough jobs for people to be employed in the future? And how do we think about our society as a less job, not enough jobs, but people need that income to live in a satisfactory way?
Income first. Who wants to talk about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would agree absolutely that income is essential. That's why we spend so much time talking about income gaps, pure and simple. I mean, money isn't the only thing that matters, but it's such a powerful force. How do you ensure that people have enough incomes? Well, I mean, enough income and good employment. Well, I mean, there's a lot of things you can do in the short term. I mean, they're not easy. If they were, we would have done them already. But, investing more in training, investing more in research and development so that there are those highly paid jobs for people who are highly skilled. You could also be encouraging the spread of the living wage, for example, which is arguing that people need to be paid $18.80 an hour rather than $14.25.
Do you all support that, by the way, the living wage in the panel?
In part.
Yeah.
In part?
Not all people on the minimum wage are necessarily living in poverty. About 40% of the people on minimum wage are students. So I know any student would argue for a bigger wage, but that's not necessarily the best place to go. So I don't think minimum wage is necessarily the best solution here.
I think it's part of the package. I mean, it's not the only one, but I think absolutely doing something to boost. I mean, bear in mind, you've talked a lot about the children who are in poverty. Well, over a third of those children have a parent who's either self-employed or on a full-time work. Half of them overall have a parent who's in some kind of work. So the levels of income for people who are working is definitely part of the picture, although you're absolutely right, you won't address everything just by having a living wage or a high minimum wage.
Let's be clear, we're paying for this today. The cost to keep a child in high school is about $11,500 a year. Cost to send a child to university is about $14,500. The cost of a NEET, anybody heard of that term NEET? Youth between 16 and 24 who's not in education, employment or training, that's $29,000 per year. And to send a person to prison costs $100,000 a year. So where do you think we should spend our money? When the problem's already happened or early on?
Fantastic. Look, in summing, a quote from you, Scott, actually, around the panel, every kid is born something. No kid is born bad. They just lack the right nurturing. Maybe that is a starting point, a short summation around the panel on inequality. Max?
One thing I wanted to say, I've been thinking about earlier about the woman who raised the question about drugs and alcohol, and it's a genuine issue that you raise, and I know what the things you must see, but I think in the bigger picture, Deborah's right. I don't think we're going to get out of this by blaming individuals. Families Commission did a great bit of research a couple of years ago when they looked at the sort of the budgeting habits of families across the spectrum, and the food budgeting habits of low-income families are identical to those of higher-income families. Low-income families are just as likely to make a shopping list before they go to the supermarket, just as likely to have a food budget, just as likely to plan meals in advance. The issue is not their inability to budget or the fact that they spend their money badly, it's just the lack of income. And then flipping it around, one final thing, which Deborah alluded to, there's been research recently about the effect of financial stress on your ability to make decisions, and this comes back to these questions about individual responsibility and choice. One experiment that I've seen discussed showed that if you're living in poverty, major financial stress, like having a $1,500 bill for car repairs, has the same effect on your ability to make good decisions as going an entire night without sleep. So that lack of income and the pressure of financial shocks, it's not that people are poor because they make bad choices, I think, in the main. It is that once you're in poverty, it is incredibly difficult to make good choices. And it's extraordinary that most people show such resilience when they are in poverty. So again, I don't think we're going to get out of this by blaming individuals. These are structural things. Inequality, is something that affects all of us. And I think we all need to think about what kind of society we're shaping for the next 30 years.
In summation, Deborah, every kid is born something, no kid is born bad.
And every baby has the potential to be our future problem solvers and leaders and the carers of our elderly. I think that one of the unfortunate effects of inequality is the social distance that it creates and the empathy gap, which can mean that those who are doing well are unable to empathise with those who are not. And that's a challenge for all of us to keep in mind. And if we keep our focus on the babies and remember that every year in New Zealand, 60 babies die before the age of 1 from poverty-related illnesses, then we can start to take action.
Right, and Scott, you said it, that was your quote, every kid is born something, no kid is born bad. In summation.
The good news here is that we all have a chance to do something about it. And the even better news is that if we do get involved, it's actually great. It becomes a very selfish act. And that's summarised by a great quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson that says, "No person can sincerely try to help somebody else without thereby helping themselves."
Fantastic.
So let's get involved.
And finally, he gate crashes all my shows, right or wrong. A final thought. Every kid is born something. What do you think?
With infinite potential.
Yeah.
And let's go to the audience for the final thought. What do you think, the Wanaka Millionaire? Every kid is born something, no kid is born bad.
And we should mould our society to give them every opportunity to reach their potential. And that should be the standard by which we judge everything we do. We say, is this going to increase the potential of our children?
Great. Fantastic stuff. Hey, a round of applause for Max Rashbrook, Deborah Morris-Travers, Scott Gilmore, and thank you for coming. And by the way, yes, Max's book, Inequality, is on sale. There's loads of them out there, so have a coffee, have a read, and thank you very much for coming this morning. Thank you. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Wallace.
Thank you very much.